She was the voiceless maid who cleaned his chambers, invisible until the moment he collapsed from the poisoned wine she'd brought him. She was forced to be silent for life to avoid being claimed by the Alpha King. Now he lay dying, and only her forbidden voice could save him, at the cost of everything she'd sacrificed to protect. What would she do? Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Alarion's capital like whispered secrets, and Draven Blackthorn watched it from his chamber window with the keen eyes of a predator who had learned never to trust the calm. As Alpha King, he understood that silence often preceded the storm, yet he had grown comfortable with the particular quiet that surrounded one member of his household staff. The Silent Maid, as the courtiers called her, moved through his private quarters with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. She never spoke, never made unnecessary noise, never drew attention to herself beyond the meticulous perfection of her work. For 3 years, she had tended to his chambers, and in all that time he had never heard her voice. Draven found himself studying her reflection in the tall mirror as she arranged fresh mountain flowers in the crystal vase beside his desk. Her movements possessed an elegance that spoke of noble breeding, yet her position suggested otherwise. Dark hair fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, and when she occasionally glanced up, her violet eyes held depths that seemed to carry secrets too heavy for someone so young. "The council meeting has been moved to the afternoon," he said aloud, testing, as he always did, whether she might respond. She paused for the briefest moment, her fingers stilling on the flower stems before continuing her work with a slight nod of acknowledgement. Something about her silence troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of someone naturally reserved, but rather the careful, deliberate silence of someone who had learned that speaking carried too high a price. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin, drawn to mysteries he couldn't solve, and sensing something significant that remained just beyond his understanding. The morning routine continued as it had for years, with her moving efficiently through tasks that kept his private world organized and peaceful. Yet today, Draven noticed details that had previously escaped his attention. The way she held her breath when he spoke directly to her, the tremor in her hands when their eyes met accidentally in the mirror, the subtle tension in her shoulders that suggested constant vigilance against some unseen threat. As she prepared to leave, gathering her cleaning supplies with the same silent efficiency she brought to everything, Draven found himself moving toward the door. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded wolves across the northern territories for over a decade. She froze, her back to him, and he could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. Whatever kept her silent, it was fear. Not of him, but of something far more dangerous than an Alpha King's displeasure. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. In the servants' quarters beneath the main castle, Lyra's hands shook as she set down her cleaning supplies and pressed her back against the cold stone wall. The Alpha King's voice echoed in her memory, that single word, wait, carrying enough authority to make her heart race with terror and something else she dared not name. 23 years of life, and 16 of them spent in absolute silence. The curse that bound her tongue felt heavier today, as if the very air around the Alpha King challenged the magical chains that kept her mute. She touched her throat unconsciously, remembering her father's words from all those years ago when the witch's vengeance had first fallen upon their family. "Your voice is his life," her father had whispered as they'd hidden in the basement of their burning cottage. "Speak, and I die." The witch made certain of that. "Your silence is all that stands between me and the grave." Lyra closed her eyes and let herself remember the man who had raised her alone after her mother's death. Thomas Greenwood, former captain of the Royal Guard, who had discovered the witch's plot to poison the previous king, and had exposed her treachery at the cost of everything they held dear. The witch's curse hadn't just stolen Lyra's voice, it had stolen their entire future, forcing them into exile and servitude. Her father worked now in the castle stables, his once proud bearing bent by years of manual labor and the weight of knowing his daughter paid the price for his righteousness. They saw each other only briefly, passing in corridors with nothing more than meaningful glances to sustain their connection. Even written words were dangerous. The witch's magic could interpret any attempt at communication as breaking the curse. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made Lyra straighten and resume her duties. Other servants hurried past, gossiping about the upcoming visit from the Northern Witch Covens, diplomatic missions that arrived with increasing frequency since the Alpha King's mysterious illness had begun manifesting 3 months ago. "They say Lady Seraphina's healing abilities are unmatched," whispered one of the kitchen maids. "If anyone can cure whatever's afflicting His Majesty, it would be her." Lyra's blood turned cold. Lady Seraphina, the witch's daughter, the one being positioned to save the Alpha King through methods that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with binding him to her will. The same pattern was repeating itself, just as it had with the previous king, but this time Lyra was close enough to see the trap being set. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She possessed knowledge that could save the Alpha King's life, but speaking that knowledge would end her father's. Silence had become both her prison and her protection, a cage that kept her safe while forcing her to watch helplessly as history prepared to repeat its darkest chapter. As evening fell, and she made her way through empty corridors toward her small chamber, Lyra allowed herself one dangerous thought. What if there was another way? Chapter 3. The King's Growing Suspicion. 3 days had passed since Draven's brief exchange with the Silent Maid, and her reaction continued to plague his thoughts with the persistence of an unsolved puzzle. As Alpha King, he had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct screamed that something significant lay hidden beneath her enforced quiet. The morning brought news that did nothing to improve his mood. The delegation from the Northern Witch Covens had sent word of their early arrival, led by the renowned healer Lady Seraphina, whose reputation for curing supernatural ailments had spread throughout the realm. His advisors spoke of her visit with barely concealed relief, as if her presence alone would solve the mysterious weakness that had been sapping his strength for months. Draven dismissed their optimism with the wariness of someone who had survived too many political machinations to believe in convenient solutions. His wolf had grown increasingly agitated as his physical condition deteriorated, and the beast's paranoia infected his human consciousness with suspicions that felt almost prophetic in their intensity. "Your Majesty," Captain Morris announced from the doorway. "The morning reports from the border patrols." As Draven reviewed the documents detailing livestock deaths and strange weather patterns that might indicate supernatural interference, he became aware of the Silent Maid's presence in the adjoining chamber. She moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency, but something had changed in her demeanor since their last encounter. He found himself watching her reflection in the window glass, noting the way she paused whenever talk turned to the incoming delegation. Her shoulders tensed when Lady Seraphina's name was mentioned, and once, when Captain Morris described the witch's supposed healing abilities, Draven could have sworn he saw her hands clench into fists. "Captain," Draven said suddenly, an idea forming with crystalline clarity. "What do you know about the Silent Maid's background?" Morris looked surprised by the question. "Very little, Your Majesty. She appeared at the castle gates 3 years ago with impeccable references and has served without incident since. Why do you ask?" Her silence. "Has anyone ever determined why she doesn't speak?" "The general assumption is that she's mute, sir. Born that way, perhaps, or injured in some accident. She's never indicated otherwise." But Draven's enhanced hearing had caught something Morris missed. The sharp intake of breath from the next room when they'd begun discussing her. Someone who was truly mute wouldn't react to the sound of her own situation being analyzed. Someone who was choosing silence, however, might find such conversations deeply uncomfortable. After Morris departed, Draven remained at his desk, ostensibly working but actually listening to the subtle sounds of the Silent Maid completing her tasks. When she entered his chamber to dust the bookshelves, he made his decision. "I know you can hear me," he said without looking up from his papers. "And I'm beginning to suspect you can speak as well. The question is why you choose not to." The silence that followed felt different from her usual quiet, charged with tension and something that might have been fear. When he finally looked up, she stood frozen beside his bookshelf, her violet eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. "I won't force you to answer," he continued gently, "but I want you to know that whatever keeps you silent, you're safe in my presence." For a moment, her lips parted as if she might respond. Then her face crumpled with an anguish so profound it made his chest tighten with unexpected protectiveness. She fled the room without completing her duties, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine and the echo of her silent distress. Chapter 4. Dangerous Recognition. In the privacy of her small chamber, Lyra pressed her hands to her mouth to contain the sobs that threatened to escape. The Alpha King's words echoed in her mind with the devastating accuracy of someone who saw through her carefully constructed facade with terrifying ease. For 16 years, she had perfected the art of invisibility, of moving through the world without leaving traces that might invite questions or scrutiny. But Draven Blackthorn was not like other people. His wolf's instincts, already legendary throughout the realm, seemed particularly attuned to detecting deception and hidden truths. The way he looked at her suggested he saw beyond the surface role of silent maid to something deeper, something that could prove catastrophically dangerous for both her and her father. The cruel irony of her situation pressed down on her with renewed weight. Every day that passed brought her closer to the man her soul recognized as its mate, while the curse that bound her tongue made any real connection impossible. She had felt the pull from the first moment she'd entered his service, a recognition that went beyond mere attraction to something fundamental and inescapable. Her wolf, suppressed by the same magic that stole her voice, stirred restlessly whenever she was near him. The mating bond sang between them like a violin string stretched to breaking point, audible only to her because his attention was focused on the mysterious illness that clouded his supernatural senses. That illness was no accident. Lyra had watched Lady Seraphina's previous visits to the castle, ostensibly social calls that always coincided with the gradual weakening of the Alpha King's abilities. The witch's daughter moved through the court like a spider spinning an invisible web, her beauty and apparent concern masking the slow-acting poison that would eventually leave him vulnerable to the binding ritual planned for the blood moon. The sound of approaching footsteps made Lyra straighten and wipe away the tears that had escaped despite her best efforts. A soft knock on her door was followed by the familiar voice of Mrs. Hendricks, the head housekeeper who had shown Lyra kindness during her first difficult months at the castle. "Child, His Majesty requests your presence in his study. He seemed concerned about your welfare." The word sent panic racing through Lyra's veins. If the Alpha King continued to show her personal attention, it would inevitably draw the notice of others, including the spies that undoubtedly reported to Lady Seraphina about everything that occurred within the castle walls. The witch's daughter tolerated no competition for the Alpha King's attention, and her methods of elimination were both creative and final. "I've prepared a tea service," Mrs. Hendricks continued gently. "Perhaps you might bring it to him. He's been working late again, and the poor man needs someone to ensure he eats properly." Lyra nodded, knowing she had no choice but to comply. The head housekeeper's request was really in order, and refusing would only create more questions she couldn't answer. As she prepared the tea tray with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm, she tried to formulate some way to discourage the Alpha King's growing interest without revealing the truth that would destroy everything she'd worked to protect. The walk to his study felt like a journey to the executioner's block, each step bringing her closer to a confrontation that could end with her father's death and her own destruction. Chapter 5. A Moment of Understanding. Draven looked up from his correspondence as the silent maid entered his study carrying the tea service, her movements more cautious than usual, and her violet eyes carefully averted from his face. The fear he had glimpsed earlier remained, but underneath it he sensed something else, a desperate sort of resolve, as if she had made some difficult decision during their time apart. "Thank you," he said, as she set the tray on the small table beside his reading chair, Mrs. Hendricks worries too much about my eating habits, but I suppose her concern is justified given recent circumstances. She arranged the cups and plates with meticulous precision, her hands steady despite the tension he could feel radiating from her like heat from a forge. When she began to turn away, he spoke again, his voice deliberately gentle. "Please, stay. I'd like company while I drink my tea." The request clearly distressed her, but she couldn't refuse a direct order from the Alpha King. She positioned herself near the door, ready to flee if necessary, her posture that of someone prepared for attack. The reaction puzzled him. He had never given her reason to fear him personally, yet she acted as if his very presence posed some mortal threat. "I've been thinking about our earlier conversation," he said, settling into his chair with the teacup cradled in his hands. Or rather, my side of the conversation. "I realize I may have made you uncomfortable, and I apologize for that." Her eyes widened slightly, and he caught a glimpse of something that might have been surprise. How long had it been, he wondered, since someone had apologized to her for anything? "I have a confession to make," he continued, watching her face carefully. "I've been ill for several months now. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just a gradual weakening that my healers can't explain. It's made me more observant, perhaps. More attuned to things I might have overlooked when I was at full strength." She went very still, and he noticed her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Whatever she knew or suspected about his condition, it affected her deeply. "The delegation arriving tomorrow claims to have solutions to my problem," he said, taking a sip of tea that tasted faintly bitter despite the honey Mrs. Hendricks had provided. "Lady Seraphina has quite a reputation as a healer. Have you heard of her?" The question hit its mark with devastating accuracy. The silent maid's face went white, and her hands began to shake visibly. She took a step toward him, then stopped herself, her expression torn between desperate urgency and paralyzing fear. "You know something about her," Draven said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace that marked him as a predator despite his current weakness. "Something that frightens you." She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement that seemed to cost her enormous effort. "Is she dangerous?" Another nod, more emphatic this time, accompanied by an expression of such profound terror that his wolf responded with a surge of protective fury. Someone or something had hurt this woman badly enough to leave her afraid of her own voice, and now that same threat extended to him. "Can you show me?" he asked, moving to his desk where paper and ink waited. "Can you write what you're afraid to say?" For a moment, hope flickered in her eyes. Then her face crumpled with despair, and she shook her head violently. Even written words were forbidden to her, apparently. Whatever bound her silence was thorough and cruel in its completeness. The teacup slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone floor as a wave of dizziness swept through him. The bitter aftertaste he had dismissed now revealed itself as something far more sinister than poor brewing. As darkness closed around the edges of his vision, the last thing he saw was the silent maid rushing toward him, her mouth open in what might have been a scream. Chapter 6. The First Dose. Lyra caught the Alpha King as he collapsed, his impressive frame suddenly dead weight in her arms as the poisoned tea completed its work. Panic flooded her system as she struggled to lower him gently to the floor, her mind racing through options that seemed equally impossible and terrifying. The poison was subtle, designed to mimic the gradual weakening that had been building for months, but this dose was stronger than the others, meant to render him unconscious and vulnerable for the arrival of Lady Seraphina's delegation. The witch's daughter would present herself as his savior while binding him with magic that would make him her willing puppet. Lyra pressed her ear to his chest, relief flooding through her as she detected the steady beat of his heart. The poison was meant to weaken, not kill. At least, not yet. The actual death would come later, after the binding ritual had served its purpose, and Lady Seraphina no longer needed the pretense of healing him. The sound of footsteps in the corridor sent terror racing through her veins. If someone found her alone with the unconscious Alpha King, suspicion would inevitably fall on the silent maid who had brought him tea just before his collapse. She needed to get help, but she couldn't speak to summon it, and leaving him alone would make her look guilty of whatever had befallen him. "Your Majesty?" Captain Morris's voice called from the hallway, growing closer with each word. "The Border Patrol reports have arrived." He appeared in the doorway and stopped short at the sight of his unconscious king lying on the floor with the silent maid kneeling beside him. His hand went immediately to his sword as his eyes took in the shattered teacup and Lyra's obvious distress. "Step away from him," Morris commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "What happened here?" Lyra raised her hands to show she meant no harm, then pointed at the broken cup and mimed drinking. Morris's expression shifted from suspicion to grim understanding as he knelt beside the Alpha King and detected the faint almond scent that lingered around the spilled tea. "Poison," he muttered, then looked up at Lyra with sharp intelligence. "You're saying he was poisoned? But you brought the tea." She shook her head frantically and pointed at herself, then made a gesture of drinking from an invisible cup and falling down. Morris's eyes narrowed as he tried to interpret her meaning. "You're saying you would have been affected too if you had drunk it? That the poison was already in the tea when you brought it?" Her grateful nod confirmed his deduction, and she saw some of the suspicion leave his face. But time was running out. They needed to get the Alpha King to his chambers and summon healers who could counteract the poison before it did permanent damage. Morris lifted his king with the ease of someone accustomed to carrying wounded warriors from battlefields. "Come with me," he ordered Lyra. "His Majesty will want to speak with you when he wakes up, and I suspect you know more about this than you can say." As they hurried through the corridors toward the royal chambers, Lyra caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the shadows near the main staircase. Lady Seraphina had arrived ahead of schedule, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach her cold green eyes. The witch's daughter had come to play her part as the grieving healer, arriving just in time to save the Alpha King from a mysterious ailment that would conveniently require her constant presence and intimate magical intervention. The trap was closing, and Lyra was running out of time to find some way to warn him without sacrificing her father's life. Chapter 7. The Healer's Arrival. Draven woke to the sensation of cool hands on his forehead and the scent of exotic herbs that seemed familiar, yet troubling in ways he couldn't immediately identify. His vision cleared slowly, revealing the concerned faces of his personal physician, Captain Morris, and a woman whose beauty was so striking it seemed almost supernatural. "Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice carrying musical tones that seemed designed to soothe and entrance. "I am Lady Seraphina. I arrived just as news of your collapse reached the delegation quarters. By the grace of the moon goddess, I was able to stabilize your condition." Memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. The tea, the bitter aftertaste, the silent maid's desperate expression of warning just before darkness claimed him. He tried to sit up, but weakness pervaded his limbs like lead weights, making even simple movements require tremendous effort. "The poison was subtle but potent," Lady Seraphina continued, her hands glowing with a faint silver light as she maintained some sort of healing magic over his chest. "Another hour, and the damage might have been irreversible. Someone clearly wanted you weakened but not dead, at least not immediately." "Where is she?" Draven asked, his voice rougher than usual from whatever toxins had been coursing through his system. "The maid who brought the tea. Where is she?" Captain Morris stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Confined to quarters under guard, Your Majesty. Though I should mention that her actions immediately after your collapse suggest she was not the one who poisoned you. She seemed genuinely distressed and tried to help rather than flee." Lady Seraphina's hands stilled for just a moment, so briefly that someone without supernatural senses might have missed it. But Draven caught the pause, along with a subtle shift in her scent that suggested displeasure rather than the professional concern she displayed. "You're very trusting of servants," she said with a light laugh that held an edge of criticism. "In my experience, those who serve in royal households often harbor resentments that can manifest in dangerous ways. Perhaps it would be wise to question her more thoroughly. The suggestion sat poorly with Draven's instincts. His wolf, still sluggish from the poison but increasingly alert, responded to Lady Seraphina's presence with unease rather than gratitude. Everything about her felt wrong. Too perfect, too convenient, too eager to cast suspicion on the one person who had tried to warn him. "I'll speak with her myself when I'm stronger," he said, watching Lady Seraphina's reaction carefully. "In the meantime, I want guards posted on my food preparation and a complete investigation of how the poison entered my tea service." "Of course," Morris replied. "I've already begun questioning the kitchen staff. But, Your Majesty, Lady Seraphina believes you'll need ongoing treatment to fully recover from this attack. The poison has affected your supernatural abilities in ways that require specialized healing." It was true. Draven could feel the deadness where his wolf's strength should be, the unnatural quiet where enhanced senses should provide constant information about his environment. Without his supernatural abilities, he was merely human, vulnerable in ways that an Alpha King could never afford to be. "I would be honored to provide whatever healing you require," Lady Seraphina said, her voice carrying undertones that seemed designed to inspire trust and dependence. "My magic is particularly suited to supernatural ailments, and I have experience with the sort of gradual poisoning you've endured." The phrasing struck him as odd. How could she know the poisoning had been gradual unless she had knowledge of previous attacks? His expression must have shown his suspicion because Lady Seraphina quickly clarified. "The symptoms you've described over the past months are consistent with slow-acting toxins designed to weaken supernatural bonds. It's a technique sometimes used by those who wish to capture rather than kill their targets." The explanation was reasonable, but Draven's instincts continued to scream warnings he couldn't yet articulate. As Lady Seraphina resumed her healing ministrations, he found his thoughts turning to the silent maid and her desperate attempt to communicate something crucial before the poison took effect. Whatever she knew about his condition and Lady Seraphina's involvement, he needed to hear it, even if she couldn't speak. Chapter 8. Questions Without Answers. The interrogation chamber in the castle's lower levels was a place designed for extracting truth from those reluctant to provide it. But Draven had chosen a more comfortable setting for his conversation with the silent maid. His private sitting room, with its warm firelight and comfortable chairs, was meant to encourage openness rather than intimidate through fear. 2 days had passed since the poisoning incident, 2 days during which Lady Seraphina had provided healing treatments that restored some of his physical strength, while leaving his supernatural abilities frustratingly diminished. She explained this as a necessary part of the recovery process, but his wolf remained silent and his enhanced senses stayed muted in ways that felt increasingly unnatural. The silent maid entered the room with Captain Morris, her violet eyes immediately finding Draven's face with an expression of such profound relief that his chest tightened with unexpected emotion. She had been afraid for him, he realized. Genuinely, deeply afraid in a way that went far beyond servants' concern for master. "Please, sit," he said, indicating the chair across from his own. "Captain Morris, you may wait outside." Morris hesitated. "Your Majesty, given recent events—" "She saved my life by trying to warn me," Draven interrupted, his voice carrying enough authority to forestall further argument. "I hardly think she poses a threat now." After Morris withdrew, closing the door behind him with obvious reluctance, Draven studied the woman who had haunted his thoughts for days. She sat on the edge of her chair as if ready to flee, her hands clasped tightly in her lap and her breathing shallow with anxiety. "I know you can't speak," he began gently, "but I need to understand what you know about what happened to me. Can you nod or shake your head to answer questions?" She nodded once, a careful movement that suggested even this limited communication carried risks. "Do you know who poisoned my tea?" Her face went pale, and she looked toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. After a long moment, she gave the smallest of nods. "Is it someone currently in this castle?" Another nod, accompanied by an expression of such terror that Draven felt his protective instincts surge despite his weakened state. Someone I trust? This time, the nod was more emphatic, and tears began to form in her eyes. She was trying to warn him about someone in his inner circle, someone who had access and opportunity to poison him repeatedly without detection. Lady Seraphina? The reaction was immediate and devastating. The silent maid's face crumpled with anguish, and she pressed her hands to her mouth as if physically holding back words that demanded to be spoken. Her nod was barely perceptible, but it confirmed his growing suspicions about the witch who claimed to be healing him. She's been poisoning me for months, hasn't she? The gradual weakening wasn't a natural illness. Another agonized nod, followed by something that looked like an attempt to speak that ended in visible pain. Whatever kept her silent was actively preventing her from providing more detailed warnings. Is there more I need to know? Something about why she's doing this? She nodded frantically, then gestured toward herself in a way that suggested personal involvement. Whatever Lady Seraphina's ultimate plan, it somehow involved the silent maid directly. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze with terror. A moment later, Lady Seraphina's voice called from outside the door. Your Majesty? I've prepared your evening treatment. The poison's effects require consistent magical intervention to prevent permanent damage. The silent maid's expression became desperate, her eyes pleading with him to understand something she couldn't say. Then she did something that shocked him to his core. She pressed her lips together and shook her head slightly, then pointed at him and made a gesture as if something was being wrapped around his wrists. Binding. She was warning him about magical binding. Before he could respond, she rose and moved toward the door, her posture once again that of the invisible servant. But as she passed his chair, she paused just long enough to press something into his hand, a small piece of paper that felt warm to the touch. By the time Lady Seraphina entered with her glowing hands and healing smile, the silent maid had vanished into the corridors, leaving Draven with a fragment of hope and a piece of evidence that might save his life. Chapter 9. Hidden Messages. In the privacy of his chambers after Lady Seraphina's latest healing session, Draven examined the paper the silent maid had pressed into his hand. The parchment was blank, but the warmth he had felt suggested magic of some kind, perhaps a message that would reveal itself under specific conditions. He tried holding it near the fire, but the heat produced no visible change. Water from his wash basin similarly failed to reveal hidden text. Growing frustrated with his weakened supernatural senses, he pressed the paper against his chest where his heart beat steadily, hoping that contact with his life force might activate whatever magic lay dormant within it. Slowly, words began to appear in elegant script that seemed to write itself across the page in silver ink that glowed with moonlight. Your Majesty, I cannot speak the truth that would save you, but I can write it under the moon goddess's protection. Lady Seraphina is the witch's daughter who poisoned the previous king. She seeks to bind you through false healing, weakening your wolf so that you cannot resist her magic when the blood moon rises in 3 days. The binding ritual will make you her puppet, and through you she will claim the throne. I know this because my father exposed her mother's crimes 16 years ago, and we have lived under a curse of silence ever since. If I speak or write freely, my father dies. This message can only exist because I write it in your presence, and the moon goddess recognizes the mating bond between us. You are my true mate, and that connection allows me to warn you even though it may cost me everything. Trust no food or drink she provides. Her magic grows stronger as yours weakens. Break the pattern, and you break her power. The words faded as soon as he finished reading them, the magic consuming itself to prevent discovery. But the message had burned itself into his memory with the clarity of absolute truth. Everything made sense now. The gradual weakening, Lady Seraphina's convenient arrival, the silent maid's desperate attempts to warn him despite the obvious cost to herself. Mating bond. The words echoed in his mind with profound implications he hadn't allowed himself to consider. His wolf's attraction to the silent maid, the protective fury he felt when she was threatened, the way her presence soothed him even in his weakened state. All of it pointed to a connection that went far beyond mere attraction. Lyra. Her name was Lyra, and she was his mate. The revelation brought clarity along with devastating understanding of her situation. Cursed to silence by a witch's vengeance, watching helplessly as the same pattern that had destroyed the previous king played out again with the man fate had chosen as her partner. The cruelty of it was staggering, forced to choose between her father's life and her mate's freedom. A soft knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. "Your Majesty?" Lady Seraphina's voice carried through the thick wood. "I've brought your evening tonic. The healing process requires precise timing to be effective." The irony wasn't lost on him. The healing tonics had been the delivery method for the poison all along, administered by the very person who claimed to be curing him. But now he knew the truth, and knowledge was power, even when supernatural strength had been stolen. "A moment," he called, moving to his wardrobe where a concealed panel hid emergency supplies, including weapons that didn't rely on supernatural abilities. If he was going to break Lady Seraphina's pattern, he needed to be prepared for her reaction when she realized her careful manipulation had been exposed. "I'm coming in," she announced, and he heard the click of the lock being turned by magic rather than key. So much for the illusion that he had any privacy or security in his own chambers. As Lady Seraphina entered with her glowing hands and poisoned remedies, Draven positioned himself near the hidden weapons while maintaining the facade of a weakened ruler grateful for her ministrations. The game had changed, but she didn't know it yet. The blood moon was only 3 days away, which meant he had very little time to turn the tables on a witch who had been planning this manipulation for months. But he had one advantage she couldn't have anticipated: a mate whose love had found a way to warn him despite a curse designed to ensure her silence. Chapter 10. The Pretense Begins. Draven accepted the glowing chalice from Lady Seraphina's hands with the grateful expression of someone who believed she was saving his life. The bitter liquid within carried the now familiar taste of subtle poison, but this time he was prepared. A small charm pressed against his tongue, one of several he had retrieved from his emergency supplies, would neutralize the toxins while allowing him to appear affected by them. "Your recovery is progressing beautifully," Lady Seraphina said, her voice carrying satisfaction that sounded more predatory than professional. "The blood moon in 3 days will provide optimal conditions for the final healing ritual. Your supernatural abilities should return fully then." The lie came so smoothly that Draven almost admired her skill. Everything about her presence projected competence and concern, from her elegant bearing to the way she monitored his pulse with gentle fingers that glowed with healing magic. Only his knowledge of her true nature allowed him to see past the performance to the calculating intelligence beneath. "I'm grateful for your dedication," he replied, allowing a note of dependency to enter his voice. "I confess I've been worried about the kingdom's security while I've been weakened. It's reassuring to know the healing will be complete soon." Something flickered in her green eyes. Triumph, perhaps, at how thoroughly she believed she had deceived him. "Your concern for your people is admirable, but unnecessary. During the ritual, I'll ensure the transition of power occurs smoothly. Your trusted advisors will continue to serve under my guidance." The casual mention of transition of power confirmed what Lyra's message had warned him about. Lady Seraphina wasn't just planning to bind him, she intended to rule through him, making him a puppet king while she wielded true authority from the shadows. The same fate that had befallen his predecessor, whose mysterious decline and dependence on a beautiful healer had ended with his early death and political chaos. "Captain Morris mentioned concerns about the poisoning incident," Draven continued, testing her reaction. "He believes it might have been an inside job, someone with access to the royal quarters." Lady Seraphina's expression shifted to one of thoughtful concern. "I've been considering that possibility as well. The Silent Maid has been remarkably close to these incidents. Perhaps it would be wise to question her more thoroughly, under magical compulsion if necessary to overcome her limitation." The suggestion sent ice through Draven's veins. Magical compulsion on someone already under a curse could be fatal, especially if that person was forced to speak truths that would trigger the original binding. Lady Seraphina was essentially suggesting murder while maintaining the pretense of investigation. "I'll consider it," he replied carefully, "though I'm reluctant to use such extreme measures without clear evidence of guilt." "Of course," she agreed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your compassion is one of your most admirable qualities. But remember, Your Majesty, mercy toward enemies is often cruelty toward those you're sworn to protect." After she departed with promises to return for his evening treatment, Draven remained in his chair, processing the full scope of the web that had been woven around him. Every person he trusted could be compromised. Every meal, every drink, every interaction with Lady Seraphina pushed him closer to the blood moon ritual that would steal his freedom forever. But now he had an ally, even if she couldn't speak. Lyra had found a way to warn him despite impossible odds, which meant she might have other ways to help, if he could protect her long enough to discover them. Chapter 11. Desperate Measures. In the servants' quarters, Lyra paced her small chamber like a caged wolf, her heart hammering with the knowledge that time was running out. The message she had managed to send the Alpha King through the moon goddess's blessing had drained her magical reserves, and she could feel the curse tightening around her throat like a noose with each passing hour. 3 days until the blood moon. 3 days until Lady Seraphina would perform the binding ritual that would turn Draven into a puppet and claim the throne through supernatural manipulation. 3 days to find some way to save both her mate and her father without sacrificing either one to the witch's vengeance. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze, heavy boots accompanied by the lighter step of someone moving with predatory grace, guards, and someone else. Her door opened without a knock to reveal Captain Morris flanked by 2 armed soldiers, and behind them, the elegant figure of Lady Seraphina herself. "By order of His Majesty," Morris announced with obvious reluctance, "you are to be questioned under magical compulsion regarding the recent poisoning incident." Lyra's world tilted. If they forced her to speak under magical compulsion while the curse remained active, the competing magics would tear her apart. Or worse, they would compel her to speak the truth that would kill her father instantly. Either way, she would be dead before she could provide any useful information. Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her green eyes glittering with satisfaction, barely concealed behind a mask of professional concern. "I know this seems extreme, but the king's life hangs in the balance. Surely you understand the necessity?" The witch was moving ahead of schedule, eliminating the one person who could expose her plans before the blood moon ritual. Lyra realized with crystal clarity that Draven hadn't ordered this. Lady Seraphina was acting on her own authority and using Morris's loyalty to the crown to carry out what amounted to execution disguised as investigation. Morris stepped aside reluctantly as Lady Seraphina approached, her hands beginning to glow with silver light that felt wrong in ways Lyra's supernatural senses could detect, even through her magical suppression. This wasn't healing magic, it was compulsion, designed to force truth from unwilling subjects, regardless of the consequences to their minds or souls. "Hold her still," Lady Seraphina commanded, and the guards moved to grasp Lyra's arms. In that moment of desperation, Lyra made a choice that would change everything. Instead of submitting to the magical interrogation that would kill her, she did the one thing she had been forbidden to do for 16 years. She opened her mouth and screamed her mate's name with every ounce of power her suppressed wolf could muster. "Draven!" The sound shattered windows throughout the castle and sent magical shockwaves racing through the stone foundations. Lady Seraphina staggered backward as if struck, her compulsion magic disrupted by the raw force of a mating call that had been denied expression for years. But even as her voice rang through the corridors with supernatural strength, Lyra felt the curse activate with devastating force. Pain beyond description tore through her chest as the magical binding around her father's life began to constrict, triggered by her first spoken word in 16 years. She had chosen her mate's life over her father's, and the price was being extracted in blood and agony that threatened to tear her soul apart. Chapter 12. The Breaking Point. Draven's head snapped up from his desk as Lyra's scream tore through the castle with the force of a supernatural earthquake. The mating call hit him like a physical blow, awakening his wolf with a surge of power that shattered the chemical suppression Lady Seraphina had maintained for months. His enhanced senses exploded back to life, flooding him with information about threats and dangers he had been blind to for far too long. The scream also carried pain, devastating soul-deep anguish that made his own chest constrict with sympathetic agony. Something was happening to his mate, something that was literally killing her as he sat helpless in his chambers. The protective fury that seized him transcended rational thought, transforming him from weakened king into apex predator in the span of a heartbeat. He was moving before conscious decision took hold, supernatural speed carrying him through corridors with lethal intent. Guards scattered from his path as they felt the full weight of his restored power, recognizing that their Alpha King had returned from whatever magical suppression had diminished him. The servants' quarters were in chaos when he arrived. Windows had shattered from the force of Lyra's call, and several staff members cowered in doorways as residual magic crackled through the air like lightning seeking ground. But it was the scene in Lyra's chamber that ignited his rage beyond all control. Lady Seraphina stood over his mate's collapsed form, her hands glowing with silver magic that was clearly causing the convulsions racking Lyra's body. Captain Morris and 2 guards watched in horrified fascination as the silent maid writhed in agony that seemed to increase with each passing second. "Step away from her," Draven commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate with supernatural authority. Lady Seraphina looked up with surprise that quickly shifted to calculation. "Your Majesty, I was attempting to—" "I said step away." This time, the command carried the full weight of an alpha's dominance, compelling obedience from anyone with supernatural blood. Lady Seraphina staggered backward as if physically pushed, her magic disrupted by his overwhelming presence. Draven dropped to his knees beside Lyra, gathering her trembling form against his chest as she struggled to breathe through pain that felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside. He could sense the magical curse working its way through her system like poison, triggered by her spoken word but designed to extract a price far beyond simple vocal expression. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, his amber eyes blazing with fury that made the air itself seem to burn. "She spoke," Lady Seraphina replied, attempting to regain her composure. "For the first time since arriving at the castle, she spoke your name. The magical backlash suggests she was under some sort of binding that prevented speech. I was trying to stabilize—" "You were trying to kill her," Draven interrupted, understanding flooding through him as he felt the curse's malevolent design through their mating bond. "This isn't a backlash from speaking. This is punishment for breaking a conditional curse." Lyra's eyes fluttered open, fixing on his face with desperate intensity. Her lips moved, but only whispers emerged, words he had to strain to hear even with his enhanced senses. "My father," she gasped. "The curse. If I speak, he dies." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. The witch's vengeance hadn't just stolen Lyra's voice, it had made her father's life dependent on her silence. By speaking to save Draven, she had condemned the man who raised her to death by magical execution. But something else was happening. Even as the curse worked to claim its price, the mating bond between them was fighting back, drawing on power that predated the witch's magic by millennia. The moon goddess's blessing that had allowed Lyra to write her warning was expanding, challenging the curse's authority over one of her chosen children. "Hold on," Draven whispered against her hair. "I won't let you pay this price alone." Chapter 13. The Price of Truth. In the castle stables, Thomas Greenwood collapsed among the hay bales as agony beyond description tore through his chest. 16 years of living under the witch's curse had taught him to recognize the signs. This was the magical backlash he had always known would come if his daughter ever spoke the truth that could save the kingdom. She had chosen love over safety, her mate's life over her father's, and the curse was exacting its price with merciless efficiency. But as the magical bonds around his heart began to constrict, Thomas felt no anger toward his daughter, only pride that she had found the courage to break the silence that had protected him at such enormous cost to herself. The stable hands found him gasping for breath and rushed to summon help, but Thomas knew no healer could counteract magic that had been brewing for over a decade. The witch's curse was designed to be absolute. Speak the truth, and the price would be paid in blood. He had accepted that bargain to protect his daughter, and now she had broken it to protect the man fate had chosen as her mate. "Tell her," he whispered to one of the young stable boys who knelt beside him. "Tell Lyra, proud, always proud." But even as darkness closed around the edges of his vision, something unexpected began to happen. Silver light, warm and pure, started to flow through the stable like moonlight given substance. The moon goddess herself was manifesting, drawn by the sacrifice of a father and daughter who had chosen love over self-preservation. "Thomas Greenwood," a voice like celestial music filled the air. "Your daughter has broken her silence to save her true mate. Your sacrifice to protect her, and hers to protect him, has created a debt that must be balanced." The divine presence settled over him like a blanket of stars, and the crushing pain in his chest began to ease. The curse was still there, still trying to claim his life, but it was being challenged by something far more powerful: the direct intervention of the deity who governed love, loyalty, and the bonds between souls. "The witch's vengeance ends here," the moon goddess declared. "Love freely given and sacrifice willingly made cannot be undone by spite and hatred. Rise, Thomas Greenwood, and go to your daughter. She has need of you in the trials that are yet to come." The magical bonds around his heart shattered like glass, replaced by divine protection that made him stronger than he had been even before the curse. As Thomas struggled to his feet, power flowed through him, not the supernatural abilities of lycans or witches, but something purer: the strength that came from divine approval and a father's unconditional love. The stable boy was staring at him with wide eyes, clearly having witnessed something beyond normal human experience. "Sir, are you all right?" Thomas smiled, feeling more alive than he had in 16 years. "I'm perfect, son, and I have a daughter to go save." Chapter 14. Divine Intervention. In Lyra's chamber, the moment of her father's resurrection sent shockwaves through the magical bonds that connected them across the castle. Draven felt the change through their mating bond, a sudden shift from devastating loss to overwhelming relief that made Lyra gasp and cling to him with renewed strength. "He's alive," she whispered, her voice stronger now that the immediate threat of the curse had been neutralized. "The moon goddess, she saved him." Lady Seraphina had gone very pale, her confident demeanor cracking as she sensed the divine intervention that had just upended months of careful planning. The curse she had relied upon to keep Lyra silent was broken, which meant her most dangerous enemy was now free to speak the truth that would expose everything. "Impossible," the witch breathed. The curse was blood-bound and soul-sealed. No power in the mortal realm could— "The moon goddess isn't bound by mortal limitations," Draven interrupted, rising to his feet with Lyra in his arms. His supernatural senses were fully restored now, and he could smell the fear and fury radiating from Lady Seraphina like smoke from a fire. "Your magic has no authority over divine will." Captain Morris stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt, as he began to understand the true scope of what had been happening in his castle. "Your Majesty, should I place Lady Seraphina under arrest?" "Not yet," Draven replied, though his eyes never left the witch's face. "I want to hear what Lyra has to say first. All of it, now that she can speak freely." Lyra struggled to stand on her own, though she kept one hand pressed against Draven's chest for support. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear tones of someone born to nobility, though tempered by years of enforced humility. "Lady Seraphina is Morgana Blackwood's daughter," she began, her words falling into the silence like stones into still water. 16 years ago, my father exposed Morgana's plot to poison King Aldrich and claim the throne through magical manipulation. The witch escaped justice, but she cursed our family before fleeing. My father's life bound to my silence, ensuring I could never reveal her daughter's true identity or warn future targets. Lady Seraphina's beautiful mask was slipping away, revealing something cold and predatory beneath. Clever girl. But even if they believe your accusations, you have no proof. My identity has been carefully constructed, my reputation established through years of genuine healing work in distant kingdoms. The proof is in your magic, Lyra replied with growing confidence. Necromantic witches leave traces in everything they touch. The poison you've been giving the king, the binding spells you've woven around his supernatural abilities, even the compulsion magic you tried to use on me, all of it carries the signature of death magic disguised as healing. Draven felt the truth of her words resonate through his restored senses. Now that he knew what to look for, he could detect the wrongness in Lady Seraphina's magic, the subtle taint of power drawn from suffering and death rather than life and healing. Captain Morris, he commanded. I want Lady Seraphina confined immediately. Send word to the Mage Council requesting magical investigators who can analyze the evidence Lyra has described. But as Morris moved to carry out his orders, Lady Seraphina raised her hands with a smile that was pure malice. I don't think so, Your Majesty. You've recovered more quickly than anticipated, but you're still not strong enough to face me directly. And your mate? Her green eyes fixed on Lyra with deadly intent. She may have broken one curse, but I have others at my disposal. Dark magic began to gather around her hands, no longer disguised as healing light, but revealed as the necromantic power it had always been. Chapter 15. The Witch Revealed. Lady Seraphina's transformation from healer to witch was as dramatic as it was terrifying. The beautiful, concerned woman who had tended to Draven's illness vanished, replaced by a creature whose power radiated death and corruption. Her green eyes blazed with malevolent light, and her elegant gown shifted to midnight black as she dropped all pretense of benevolent magic. Did you really think you could outwit me so easily? She snarled, dark energy crackling between her fingers. I've been planning this for 16 years, ever since your father's interference cost my mother her life and her throne. The magic she wielded was unlike anything Draven had encountered. Not the clean, natural power of lichens or the structured spells of court mages, but something that fed on fear and pain. The very air in the chamber grew cold as necromantic energy began to build toward what could only be a killing curse. Captain Morris, get everyone out, Draven commanded, pushing Lyra behind him as he prepared to face magic that could potentially overwhelm even his restored supernatural abilities. Evacuate this entire wing of the castle. But Morris was already moving, herding the guards and servants toward the exit while shouting orders for magical defenses and emergency protocols. Years of military training had taught him to recognize battles that required strategic withdrawal rather than direct confrontation. You cannot run from me forever, Seraphina called after the fleeing soldiers. I know every ward and protection in this castle. I helped design half of them during my months of playing healer. There is nowhere you can hide that my magic cannot reach. Lyra stepped out from behind Draven, despite his protective stance, her newly freed voice carrying power that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the castle. You're wrong. This castle was built on ground blessed by the moon goddess herself. Your necromantic magic has no true authority here. Foolish girl. Divine blessing means nothing when faced with power drawn from the realm of the dead. Seraphina raised her hands, dark energy swirling around her like a miniature storm. You should have stayed silent. At least then your death would have been quick. The curse she launched was a spear of pure darkness aimed directly at Lyra's heart. But as it flew through the air, something extraordinary happened. Silver light erupted from the walls themselves, ancient protections that had lain dormant for decades suddenly blazing to life in response to the presence of necromantic magic within the castle's sacred boundaries. The dark curse struck the silver barrier and shattered like glass against stone. Its malevolent energy dispersed harmlessly into light that faded like morning mist. Seraphina staggered backward, shock and fury warring across her features. "Impossible," she breathed. "The old protections were supposed to be depleted. My mother's research indicated—" "Your mother never understood the true nature of divine blessing," Lyra interrupted, confidence growing as she felt the moon goddess's power flowing through the ancient stones. "Sacred ground doesn't lose its strength through time. It grows stronger through faith and love and sacrifice willingly given." Draven felt the shift in the magical atmosphere like a physical sensation. His supernatural abilities weren't just restored, they were enhanced by the divine energy that permeated every surface around them. The castle itself had become their ally, responding to the mating bond between him and Lyra with protective power that transcended mortal magic. "You may have surprised me," Seraphina said, her voice carrying venomous rage, "but I still have advantages you cannot counter. The blood moon ritual can be performed anywhere, and I have allies throughout the kingdom who have been positioned for exactly this contingency." Chapter 16. The Mother's Return. Morgana Blackwood materialized in the chamber like smoke given form, her presence making the very air seem to thicken with malevolent power. Where her daughter had hidden behind the mask of a healer, the elder witch made no attempt to disguise her nature. Dark robes flowed around her like liquid shadow, and her eyes blazed with the green fire of necromantic magic perfected through decades of practice. "Mother," Seraphina breathed, relief and apprehension warring in her voice. "The plan has been compromised. We need to retreat and—" "We need to finish what we started," Morgana interrupted, her gaze fixing on Lyra with hatred so intense it seemed to burn the air between them. 16 years I've waited for revenge against the man who destroyed my first attempt at the throne. I will not be denied again by his whelp of a daughter." Draven positioned himself between the witches and Lyra, his wolf responding to the threat with a growl that made the floor vibrate. Even enhanced by divine blessing, he recognized that facing two necromantic witches simultaneously would test his abilities to their limits. "The girl broke her silence," Morgana continued, circling them like a predator evaluating prey. "The curse that bound her tongue has been shattered by divine intervention. But there are other ways to ensure silence, more permanent methods that not even the moon goddess can undo." Dark magic began to build around both witches, their combined power creating pressure that made breathing difficult. The castle's protective wards were holding, but Draven could sense them straining against necromantic energy that had been accumulating for years in preparation for this moment. "You cannot win," Lyra said, though her voice trembled with the effort of standing firm against supernatural predators who had spent decades perfecting their craft. "The moon goddess has blessed our bond. Your magic has no power over divine will." Morgana laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to cut at the very air. "Divine will?" "Child, you understand nothing about the true nature of power. Your goddess may have temporarily disrupted my curse, but she cannot maintain constant protection against those who draw strength from sources she dare not touch." The elder witch raised her hands, and the temperature in the chamber plummeted as she began to channel magic from the realm of the dead. This wasn't the weakened necromancy her daughter had wielded. This was power drawn directly from the void beyond life, energy that could corrupt divine blessing if applied with sufficient force and skill. "The blood moon rises tomorrow night," Morgana declared, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from vast distances. "Whether you submit willingly or I drag your spirits into darkness, the ritual will proceed. This kingdom will fall under our dominion, and the bloodline that dared oppose us will be extinguished forever." But as the witches prepared their assault, help arrived from an unexpected source. Thomas Greenwood burst through the chamber doorway, no longer the broken stable hand who had hidden in shame for 16 years. The moon goddess's blessing had restored him to his full strength as former captain of the Royal Guard, and the sword at his side blazed with silver light that made the necromantic magic recoil like living things avoiding flame. "Lyra," he called, his voice carrying parental authority and military command in equal measure. Get behind the king. Morgana, your quarrel is with me, not with my daughter. The elder witch's eyes narrowed as she recognized the man who had once been her greatest enemy. Thomas Greenwood, I wondered if you would find the courage to face me directly instead of hiding behind your child's sacrifice. I hid from nothing, Thomas replied, advancing with the fluid grace of a trained warrior whose skills had been enhanced by divine blessing. I protected my daughter from the consequences of my choice to serve righteousness over personal safety. But that protection is no longer necessary. The sword in his hands wasn't just blessed silver, it was Moonshard, the legendary blade that had been wielded by champions of the moon goddess for over 1,000 years. How he had come to possess it, Draven didn't know, but its presence shifted the balance of power in ways that made the witches step back with obvious alarm. Chapter 17. The Father's Stand. Thomas Greenwood stood between his daughter and the witches who had tormented their family for 16 years, Moonshard blazing in his hands with light that seemed to banish shadows from every corner of the chamber. The legendary sword had appeared in his grasp the moment the moon goddess freed him from the curse, divine recognition of his role as protector and champion. You always were too noble for your own good, Thomas, Morgana said, though her confident demeanor had cracked in the face of a blessed weapon that could actually threaten her existence. That righteousness cost you everything once before. Are you prepared to let it destroy your daughter as well? My righteousness saved a kingdom from your poison, Thomas replied, advancing with the measured steps of someone who had faced supernatural threats before. And my daughter's courage saved it again. We've both paid the price for doing what was right. Now it's time for you to pay yours. Seraphina moved to flank him, dark magic crackling around her hands as she prepared to strike from an angle that would force him to choose between defending himself and protecting Lyra. But she had underestimated the tactical awareness of a former Royal Guard captain whose skills had been enhanced by divine blessing. Thomas spun with fluid grace, Moonshard's arc trailing silver fire that sliced through Seraphina's necromantic curse and sent her staggering backward with a cry of pain and fury. The blessed blade had disrupted her magic at its source, leaving her temporarily unable to channel the death energy that fueled her power. Impossible, she gasped, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. No mortal weapon can sever necromantic bonds so completely. Moonshard isn't mortal, Thomas explained, turning back to face Morgana while keeping Seraphina in his peripheral vision. It's forged from moonlight and starfire, blessed by the moon goddess herself to cut through any darkness that threatens her children. Morgana's expression shifted from confidence to calculation as she reassessed the threat they faced. A blessed warrior wielding a legendary weapon was dangerous enough, but the castle's protective wards were amplifying his power while suppressing hers. For the first time in 16 years, she was facing a battle she might not win. You may have divine favor, she said, beginning to weave a spell that made the air itself seem to writhe with malevolent energy. But I have had decades to perfect magic that draws on powers your goddess cannot touch. The realm of the dead remembers every soul I have sent to it, and they hunger for revenge against the living. The necromantic energy she channeled was different from anything she had used before. Not just magic drawn from death, but the actual essence of the departed, twisted into weapons of supernatural destruction. Ghostly forms began to materialize around her, the spirits of those who had died under her influence now bound to serve her will in undeath. Thomas felt the temperature drop as the undead manifested, their presence making even Moonshard's blessed light seem dimmer. This was magic that challenged divine authority directly, calling upon the fundamental opposition between life and death to create power that could overwhelm even blessed champions. Lyra, he called without taking his eyes off the gathering spiritual army. Can you and the king reach the castle's heart chamber? The central ward stone will amplify your mating bond enough to call down direct divine intervention. I won't leave you to face them alone, Lyra replied, her voice carrying the determination of someone who had already sacrificed everything for love and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. "You won't be leaving me," Thomas said with a smile that carried both paternal love and warrior's confidence. "You'll be giving me the power to end this permanently. Divine blessing flows stronger through those who protect family than through those who seek personal glory." He raised Moonshard high, and the blade's light exploded outward with intensity that made the undead shriek and recoil. The moon goddess was channeling her power directly through him, using his love for his daughter as a conduit for forces that could reshape the very nature of magical reality. "Go," he commanded with authority that brooked no argument. "Save your mate and your kingdom. Let your father do what fathers do. Protect their children no matter the cost." Chapter 18. The Heart of Power. The castle's heart chamber lay deep beneath the main foundations, accessible only through passages known to the royal bloodline and their most trusted guardians. Draven led Lyra through corridors carved from living stone, guided by architectural knowledge passed down through generations of kings who had ruled from this sacred stronghold. Behind them, the sounds of battle echoed through the castle as Thomas faced the gathered forces of necromantic magic with nothing but his blessed sword and paternal determination. Every clash of steel against supernatural energy made Lyra flinch, but she forced herself to keep moving toward their destination, despite her terror for her father's safety. "He'll be all right," Draven said, sensing her emotional turmoil through their mating bond. "The moon goddess doesn't grant Moonshard lightly. Your father has been chosen as her champion specifically for this battle." The heart chamber, when they finally reached it, was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. The circular room was carved from a single massive crystal that pulsed with internal light, its faceted walls reflecting their images in infinite repetition. At the center stood the ward stone, a pillar of pure moonstone that reached from floor to ceiling, its surface covered with ancient runes that seemed to shift and change as they watched. "This is where the castle's protective magic originates," Draven explained, approaching the ward stone with reverence. "Every defensive spell, every blessing that guards this stronghold, draws its power from this crystal. If we can channel our mating bond through it, we can call down divine intervention strong enough to end the threat permanently," Lyra finished, understanding flooding through her as she felt the sacred energy that permeated every surface of the chamber. But as they approached the ward stone, the crystal's light began to flicker ominously. Something was interfering with the ancient magic, corrupting it from a distance with necromantic energy that shouldn't have been able to penetrate the castle's defenses. "Morgana," Draven growled, recognizing the magical signature that was slowly poisoning the ward stone's pure energy. "She's found a way to channel corruption through the battle above. If she can taint the heart chamber, the entire castle's defensive network will collapse." Dark veins were beginning to spread through the moonstone pillar like infected blood vessels, carrying necromantic poison toward the crystal's core. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the wardstone's purification magic was overwhelmed by supernatural corruption that had been building for hours. Lyra pressed her hands against the crystal surface, feeling the moon goddess's power flowing through the stone like a river being slowly dammed by accumulating darkness. "We need to purify it before we can use it to call for help. But how do we cleanse necromantic corruption from sacred crystal?" "With sacrifice freely given," Draven replied, his understanding crystallizing as he recalled ancient legends about the ward stone's creation. The original blessing required the first Alpha King to offer his own life force to power the protective magic. It may require the same from us. The implication was clear. Using their life energy to purify the wardstone might save the castle and kingdom, but it could also kill them both in the process. Their mating bond was powerful, but channeling enough divine energy to cleanse decades of accumulated corruption would test even supernatural reserves to their limits. Above them, the sounds of battle were growing more intense. Thomas was holding his own against Morgana's undead army, but even blessed champions had limits. Soon, the witches would overwhelm his defenses and come seeking the heart chamber, bringing their corruption directly to the source of the castle's power. "Together," Lyra said, placing her hand over Draven's where it rested against the ward stone. Whatever happens, we face it together. Their mating bond flared to life as they opened themselves to the sacred energy that flowed through the crystal, divine power flooding through them with intensity that threatened to burn away everything they were in service of something greater than individual existence. Chapter 19. The Purification. The moment their combined life force touched the wardstone, Lyra felt her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of her individual self. The mating bond that connected her to Draven became a conduit for divine energy that flowed through them and into the corrupted crystal with the force of a supernatural storm. Pain unlike anything she had ever experienced tore through her as their life energy battled against the necromantic poison that had infected the Moonstone Pillar. The corruption fought back with malevolent intelligence, seeking to drain their strength and add their souls to the undead army that served Morgana's will. "Hold on." Draven's voice reached her through the agony, though she couldn't tell if he spoke aloud or directly into her mind through their bond. "The moon goddess is with us. I can feel her presence growing stronger." The sacred chamber filled with silver light that seemed to burn away the shadows clinging to the crystal's surface. Ancient runes blazed to life across the wardstone as divine energy purged 16 years of accumulated corruption with cleansing fire that left the air itself seeming purer. But the purification was demanding a price that threatened to consume them both. Lyra could feel her life force being drawn into the crystal faster than her supernatural nature could replenish it. Beside her, Draven's breathing had become labored as the process demanded more energy than even an Alpha King possessed. "It's not enough!" she gasped, understanding flooding through her as she felt the corruption fighting back with renewed strength. "Morgana's magic is too deeply rooted. We need more power than our bond alone can provide." As if summoned by her words, new voices joined their effort. Thomas Greenwood's presence blazed to life in the chamber, his warrior's spirit channeling divine blessing directly from the battle above. Other voices followed. Servants who had witnessed Lyra's courage, guards who had served under Thomas's command years ago, even citizens of the kingdom who had felt the protective magic of the castle keeping them safe. "The entire kingdom stands with you." The moon goddess's voice echoed through the chamber with power that made the crystal ring like a bell. Love freely given and sacrifice willingly made creates bonds that transcend individual strength. Let their faith become your power. The wardstone exploded with purified light that banished every trace of necromantic corruption from its crystalline structure. The purification was complete, but the effort had drained both Lyra and Draven to the point of collapse. They lay beside the now pristine Moonstone Pillar, their breathing shallow but their mating bond stronger than ever. Chapter 20. The final battle above in the main castle. Thomas felt the moment when the wardstone's power was restored. Divine energy flooded through every defensive spell with renewed strength, and his blessed sword blazed with light that made Morgana's undead army shriek in agony as sacred power burned away their necromantic bonds. "Impossible," Morgana snarled, her confident demeanor cracking as she felt her connection to the corrupted wardstone severed permanently. The heart chamber was sealed. No one could have reached it in time. "You underestimated the power of love freely given," Thomas replied, pressing his attack as Moonshard cut through her magical defenses with divine authority. "My daughter and her mate chose sacrifice over safety. Their bond has purified the very foundations of this castle." Seraphina tried to flee as her mother's magic began to fail, but the castle's restored defenses trapped her within walls that now blazed with holy light. Every corridor, every chamber, every stone had become anathema to necromantic power, making escape impossible for creatures who drew their strength from death and corruption. "Mother," she called desperately, "the teleportation circles, the backup plans are useless," Morgana admitted with bitter fury. "Divine intervention has turned this entire stronghold into a sanctuary that rejects our very existence. We cannot leave and we cannot win." But surrender was not in her nature. With a scream of rage that shattered windows throughout the castle, Morgana gathered every remaining fragment of her power for one final assault. If she could not claim the throne, she would at least drag her enemies into death with her. The spell she wove was pure destruction, not necromancy or corruption, but a magical force designed to bring down the entire castle and everyone within it. Stone walls began to crack as supernatural pressure built beyond what even sacred foundations could withstand. Thomas raised Moonshard to counter the attack, but even divine blessing had limits when faced with magic that sought mutual destruction rather than victory. The blessed sword could cut through darkness, but it could not prevent a witch from choosing annihilation over defeat. Thomas. The moon goddess's voice filled the chamber with authority that made reality itself pause to listen. Step aside. This one has chosen her fate. A figure materialized beside him, not the ethereal presence of divine will, but the moon goddess herself in physical form. She appeared as a woman of indeterminate age whose silver hair flowed like liquid moonlight and whose eyes held the depth of eternity. "Morgana Blackwood," the goddess said, her voice carrying judgment that echoed from the beginning of time. "You have poisoned my sacred ground, corrupted my blessed children, and sought to destroy love with hatred. Your choice is made, and now you face the consequences." The necromantic witch tried to complete her destruction spell, but divine presence overwhelmed her magic with the ease of sunlight banishing shadow. Morgana and Seraphina began to fade, not destroyed, but removed from the mortal realm entirely, banished to a place where their corruption could never again threaten the innocent. "No," Morgana screamed as her form became translucent. "I will have my revenge. I will—" "You will learn the difference between justice and vengeance," the moon goddess replied with finality that brooked no argument. "In the realm I send you to, perhaps you will find redemption. Or perhaps you will find only the emptiness that hatred brings to those who choose it over love." The witches vanished, leaving behind only silence and the fading scent of sulfur. Thomas lowered Moonshard, the blessed sword's light dimming as divine crisis passed and normal reality reasserted itself. Chapter 21. Healing and Truth. In the heart chamber, Lyra stirred as the immediate danger passed and the moon goddess's presence settled over the castle like a protective blanket. The purification had cost them dearly, but they were alive, and the mating bond between them thrummed with power that promised rapid healing. "Is it over?" she whispered, struggling to sit up as Draven helped support her weight. "The witches are gone," he confirmed, though his voice carried exhaustion that matched her own. "Banished by the moon goddess herself, they won't threaten anyone again." Above them, footsteps echoed through the corridors as Thomas descended to the heart chamber, his face bearing the peaceful expression of someone who had finally seen justice done after 16 years of waiting. When he entered the sacred space, Lyra felt tears streaming down her face as she saw her father truly free for the first time since childhood. "My brave daughter," he said, kneeling beside them with paternal pride that radiated from every word. "You broke the curse that bound us both. You found your voice and your courage when it mattered most." "I had to," she replied, reaching for his hand with fingers that still trembled from the ordeal. "I couldn't watch another kingdom fall to their poison. I couldn't lose my mate before I'd even had the chance to claim him properly." Thomas looked between his daughter and the Alpha King, who held her with such obvious devotion, understanding passing between them that required no words. "Your Majesty, I formally request permission to give my daughter's hand in marriage to her chosen mate, with the understanding that she chooses freely and that her happiness is the only condition that matters." Draven's laugh carried relief and joy in equal measure. "Thomas, I think the moon goddess herself has already performed that ceremony. The mating bond we share was blessed by divine intervention. But if Lyra wishes a formal wedding that the kingdom can witness—" "I want everything," Lyra said with sudden intensity, her voice growing stronger as she contemplated a future free from curses and fear. "I want the formal ceremony, the public celebration, the chance for everyone to see that love triumphs over hatred. I want to speak my vows aloud so that the entire realm can hear the voice that was stolen from me for so long." "Then you shall have it all," Draven promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that made the wardstone pulse with approving light. Chapter 22, Revelations. 3 days later, as preparations for the royal wedding proceeded throughout the castle, Lyra stood in what had once been Lady Seraphina's quarters, now being converted into proper chambers for the future queen. The irony wasn't lost on her. She would rule from rooms that had once housed the witch who sought to claim the throne through manipulation and poison. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Hendricks said from the doorway, her formal address carrying warmth that took the sting from royal protocol. "The seamstresses have finished the first fitting of your wedding gown. Would you like to review their work?" The title still felt strange, but Lyra was learning to embrace the authority that came with her position. As queen, she would have the power to protect others who faced the kind of persecution she had endured, to ensure that no child grew up voiceless because of adult conflicts and magical vengeance. "Of course," she replied, then paused as she noticed Mrs. Hendricks's careful expression. "Is there something else?" "The investigation into Lady Seraphina's activities has uncovered disturbing information," the housekeeper said delicately. "Captain Morris believes you should be informed before the wedding ceremony." In Morris's office, Lyra reviewed documents that detailed the full scope of the witch's conspiracy. For months, Lady Seraphina had been positioning her allies throughout the kingdom, placing corrupt officials in key positions and eliminating those who might have opposed her eventual claim to power. 17 people died, Morris reported grimly. Officials, healers, even servants who noticed things they shouldn't have, all made to look like natural deaths or unfortunate accidents. "And if the binding ritual had succeeded?" Lyra asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Total control of the kingdom within 6 months, Morris confirmed. Every major decision would have been influenced by necromantic magic flowing through the Alpha King. She would have ruled absolutely while appearing to be merely his devoted queen. The scope of what they had prevented was staggering. Not just Draven's freedom, but the liberty of every citizen in the realm had hung in the balance during those final hours when the witch's plans came so close to fruition. "There's more," Morris continued, his expression growing even more serious. "We found evidence that similar operations are being planned in neighboring kingdoms. Morgana wasn't working alone. She was part of a larger network of necromantic witches who seek to claim thrones throughout the northern realms." "Then our work isn't finished," Lyra said with growing resolve. "We need to warn the other kingdoms, help them identify and counter similar threats." "Your Majesty," Morris said with obvious respect, "with your permission, I'd like to recommend the formation of a new organization. Royal guards trained specifically to detect and counter supernatural threats to legitimate rulers. We could call them the Moonlight Sentinels." The name carried perfect symbolism. Protectors who served the moon goddess's justice while defending those who ruled with honor rather than corruption. It was exactly the kind of legacy Lyra wanted to create from their victory over the witches. Chapter 23. The Wedding. The royal wedding took place under the full moon, with representatives from across the kingdom gathered in the castle's great hall to witness the union of their Alpha King and his miraculously recovered queen. Lyra walked down the aisle in a gown of silver silk that seemed to capture and reflect moonlight, her voice strong and clear as she spoke the vows that would bind her to Draven for all eternity. "I, Lyra Greenwood, take you, Draven Blackthorn, as my beloved mate and king," she declared, her words carrying to every corner of the hall with supernatural clarity. "In darkness and in light, in silence and in speech, in human form and wolf, I choose you above all others for as long as the moon goddess grants us life and love." When Draven spoke his own vows, his voice carried the authority of an alpha claiming his mate before the pack and kingdom. "I, Draven Blackthorn, take you, Lyra Greenwood, as my beloved mate and queen. Your courage saved my life, your love saved my soul, and your voice will help me rule with wisdom and justice. Before all who witness this ceremony, I pledge my heart, my crown, and my life to your happiness." The moment they kissed to seal their union, silver light exploded throughout the hall as the moon goddess herself blessed their marriage with divine approval. Every person present felt the touch of sacred energy, a benediction that would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come. "Behold your king and queen," Brother Marcus announced, his voice carrying joy that infected every heart present. "May their reign bring peace to the realm and protection to all who seek justice under their rule." The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with music and dancing that echoed through every corner of the castle. But for Lyra, the most meaningful moment came when her father led her in the traditional father-daughter dance, both of them finally free to speak and laugh and share the love that had sustained them through 16 years of enforced separation. "I'm proud of you," Thomas whispered as they moved across the dance floor. "Not because you became queen, but because you never lost your compassion despite everything you suffered. That's the mark of true nobility, not bloodline, but character." "I learned it from you," she replied, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You taught me that protecting others was worth any sacrifice, that love was stronger than fear, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to let hatred win." As the evening progressed and guests gradually departed for their chambers, Lyra and Draven found themselves alone on the castle's highest balcony, looking out over the kingdom that was now truly theirs to protect and serve. "Any regrets?" Draven asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the moonlight paint the landscape in silver. "Only that it took so long to find my voice," she replied, then smiled at the irony. "Though perhaps that's exactly how it was meant to be. If I hadn't been forced into silence, I might never have learned to truly listen. And if I hadn't learned to listen, I might never have heard what your heart was trying to tell mine." Chapter 24, New Beginnings. 6 months after their wedding, Queen Lyra stood in the newly established training grounds, where the first class of Moonlight Sentinels practiced the specialized skills they would need to protect the northern kingdoms from supernatural threats. The organization had grown beyond anything she had originally envisioned, with volunteers arriving from throughout the realm to serve in humanity's first organized defense against necromantic corruption. "Your Majesty," Captain Morris reported, his new title of Sentinel Commander carrying pride that was evident in every word. "Intelligence reports suggest our early warnings prevented 3 separate attempts at magical infiltration in allied kingdoms. The network is working exactly as designed." The success filled Lyra with satisfaction that transcended personal achievement. Every threat detected and countered meant families who wouldn't lose loved ones to supernatural manipulation, kingdoms that would remain free to choose their own destinies without magical coercion. "And the academy?" she asked, referring to the school they had established to train young people with supernatural abilities in constructive rather than destructive magic. "Growing every day," Morris confirmed. "We have students from 7 different kingdoms now, all learning to use their gifts in service of protection rather than domination. The moon goddess has blessed the program, literally in some cases. Several students have reported divine visitations during their training. Through the open windows of the administrative offices, Lyra could hear the sounds of normal castle life. Servants going about their duties, guards training in the courtyard, children playing in the gardens that had been opened to the public as a symbol of the royal family's commitment to accessibility and transparency. "Your Majesty?" a familiar voice called from the doorway, and Lyra turned to see her father approaching with a young woman whose nervous expression suggested someone meeting royalty for the first time. "This is Elena Brightwater," Thomas announced with barely contained excitement. "She's been working in the castle kitchens for the past month, and she has something to tell you." Elena curtsied awkwardly, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Your Majesty, I used to be unable to speak. Not cursed like you were, but born that way. But when you broke your silence and the moon goddess's blessing spread through the castle, something changed. I found my voice for the first time in my life." The revelation hit Lyra like a physical blow. She had known that their actions had consequences beyond their personal situation, but she hadn't realized that divine intervention might have healed others who suffered similar afflictions. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least 20 that we've confirmed so far," Thomas replied with wonder. "People throughout the kingdom who were born mute, or who lost their voices to trauma or magical interference. All of them began speaking in the days following your wedding. The moon goddess's blessing didn't just restore your voice, it restored the concept of voice being a divine right that cannot be permanently stolen." Tears streamed down Lyra's face as she contemplated the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Her personal struggle had become a catalyst for healing that extended far beyond anything she had dared hope for. "There's more," Elena said, her confidence growing as she continued speaking. "Some of us who were healed, we're organizing. We want to help others who still suffer in silence, whether from magic or natural causes. We're calling ourselves the Restored Voices, and we'd like your blessing to operate as part of the Moonlight Sentinels." Chapter 25. Legacy. 1 year after breaking her curse, Queen Lyra stood before the assembled leaders of the Northern Kingdom Alliance, addressing concerns about supernatural threats that required coordinated response across multiple realms. Her voice, once stolen by hatred and fear, now carried the authority of someone who had faced the worst that dark magic could offer and emerged stronger. "We have learned that silence in the face of evil is not virtue, but complicity," she declared, her words reaching representatives from a dozen kingdoms who had gathered to formalize mutual defense agreements. "The necromantic threat we faced was not isolated. It was part of a pattern that seeks to claim power through corruption and fear. Only by speaking the truth, by refusing to let intimidation force us into quiet submission, can we protect the innocent from those who would exploit their vulnerability." The alliance accords that emerged from the summit established protocols for identifying and countering supernatural threats while protecting the rights of those who possessed magical abilities but chose to use them constructively. The Moonlight Sentinels would serve as the coordinating organization, with chapters in every major kingdom and the authority to investigate suspected necromantic activity wherever it appeared. But for Lyra, the most meaningful achievement was smaller and more personal. In the castle's newly dedicated memorial garden, a simple stone marker bore the names of all who had died during the witches' conspiracy: servants, officials, innocent bystanders who had been eliminated to protect dark secrets. Their sacrifice had not been forgotten, and their memory would serve as a reminder of why vigilance against corruption was essential. "They speak through us now," Draven said, joining her beside the memorial as evening shadows lengthened across the garden. "Every truth we tell, every injustice we prevent, every voice we help find, it honors their memory." "I used to think silence was safety," Lyra reflected, her hand resting on her still flat stomach where their first child grew. "But silence in the face of evil is just another form of complicity. Our daughter will grow up in a world where speaking the truth is protected, where no one has to choose between their voice and their family's life." The future stretched before them, full of challenges that would require both wisdom and courage to meet. But they would face those challenges together, with voices united in purpose and love stronger than any curse that hatred could devise. As the moon rose full and bright over the castle that had witnessed such transformation, Lyra spoke a final promise to the wind that carried her words across the kingdom and beyond. "Let all who would claim power through fear and manipulation know this. We will not be silent. We will not submit. And we will never stop fighting for those who cannot yet fight for themselves. The age of imposed silence is over. The age of restored voices has begun." The wind carried her declaration across mountains and valleys, through forests and cities, to every corner of the realm where people lived and loved and hoped for justice. And in countless hearts, courage kindled anew, inspired by the story of a girl who found her voice just in time to save the world.